The shrill voice cut through my dreams like a rusty knife, dragging me from the peaceful depths of sleep into the harsh fluorescent reality of my kitchen. Margaret's voice echoed through our small apartment, bouncing off the walls with the precision of a woman who had perfected the art of making others miserable. "It's 7 a.m. and you're still sleeping. Get up and make me breakfast," she screamed from the living room, her voice dripping with entitlement and disdain. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I shared with her son, David, my husband of 3 years. The paint was peeling in one corner, something we couldn't afford to fix, and I traced the familiar pattern with my eyes while my heart hammered against my ribs. Margaret had been staying with us for 2 weeks now. According to YouTube analytics, 99.6% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Ever since she'd been temporarily evicted from her apartment for noise complaints. 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. David stirred beside me, mumbling something incoherent before rolling over, pulling the thin blanket over his head. Of course he wouldn't wake up. He never did when his mother needed something. That responsibility always fell to me, the daughter-in-law who wasn't good enough, smart enough, or wealthy enough for precious David. "Sarah!" Margaret's voice crescendoed, and I could hear her heavy footsteps approaching our bedroom door. "I know you can hear me. I'm hungry, and I'm not getting any younger." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, counting to 10 the way my therapist had taught me before I couldn't afford sessions anymore. Margaret was 62 years old, perfectly capable of making her own breakfast, and had been doing so for decades before I entered the picture. But somehow, the moment she stepped foot in our home, I became her personal servant. The bedroom door burst open without so much as a knock. "There you are, you lazy girl." Margaret stood in the doorway, her gray hair in curlers, wearing a faded pink robe that had seen better days. Her small, dark eyes fixed on me with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "I've been up for an hour already. The least you could do is have breakfast ready." "Margaret," I said, sitting up slowly, trying to keep my voice level. "It's Sunday morning. And it's my day off." She snorted, a sound that had become as familiar to me as David's breathing. "Day off? From what? You work part-time at that little bookstore? That's hardly a real job. When I was your age, I was already raising 3 children and keeping house for my husband." The comparison stung, as it always did. Margaret had perfected the art of making me feel small, inadequate, like I was playing house instead of living a real life. She conveniently forgot to mention that her husband had left her when David was 12, or that she'd spent most of David's teenage years drinking her way through a series of dead-end jobs. "I'll be right there," I said, throwing off the covers. David mumbled something that might have been an apology, but his face remained buried in the pillow. I padded to the kitchen in my bare feet, the cold linoleum sending shivers up my spine. Margaret had already made herself comfortable at our small dining table, the newspaper spread out in front of her like she owned the place. She didn't look up when I entered. "I want eggs Benedict," she announced, not bothering to look away from the crossword puzzle. "And fresh orange juice, none of that concentrate garbage you usually serve." I opened the refrigerator, knowing exactly what I'd find. 2 eggs, half a carton of milk that was approaching its expiration date, and a loaf of bread that was more than a little stale. We lived paycheck to paycheck, stretching every dollar until it screamed. David's job at the auto parts store barely covered rent and utilities, and my part-time income went toward groceries and the mountain of student debt I'd accumulated before dropping out of college to marry him. "We don't have the ingredients for eggs Benedict," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I can make scrambled eggs and toast." Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. Don't have the ingredients? What kind of household are you running here? In my day, a wife made sure the pantry was always stocked. In your day, I said, my patience beginning to fray, groceries didn't cost half a paycheck. Don't you dare take that tone with me, young lady. Margaret stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I am your elder, and you will treat me with respect. Just because my son was fool enough to marry beneath his station doesn't mean you can speak to me like I'm one of your little bookstore friends. The words hit me like physical blows. Beneath his station. As if David were some kind of aristocrat instead of a 26-year-old man who still played video games until 3 a.m. and left his dirty dishes in the sink for days. I turned back to the refrigerator, my hands shaking as I reached for the eggs. I'll make what we have, I said quietly. You'll make what I asked for, Margaret shot back, or you'll go to the store and buy what's needed. I don't care if you have to wake up that lazy son of mine to drive you. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the accumulation of 2 weeks of verbal abuse, or the fact that she'd just called David lazy while expecting me to wake him up to serve her needs. Maybe it was the realization that this woman had been systematically destroying my self-worth for 3 years, chipping away at my confidence one cruel comment at a time. I set the eggs down on the counter and turned to face her. No, I said. The single word hung in the air between us like a challenge. Margaret's mouth fell open, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. What did you just say to me? I said no. My voice was steadier now, strengthened by the simple act of refusal. I'm not going to the store. I'm not waking David up to drive me, and I'm not making you eggs, Benedict. If you're hungry, you can make yourself scrambled eggs and toast, or you can figure out your own breakfast. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of purple. How dare you? I am your mother-in-law. You will do as I say. You're a guest in my home, I said, surprised by the calm in my own voice. And guests don't scream at their hosts and demand to be waited on hand and foot. Guest! Margaret's voice reached a pitch that could shatter glass. Guest? I am family! I changed that boy's diapers and raised him when his worthless father ran off. You are nothing but some little gold digger who trapped him into marriage. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. Gold digger? What gold? We could barely afford ramen noodles, and I worked just as many hours as David did. If that's how you feel, I said, then maybe you should find somewhere else to stay. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even realized I was thinking them, but once they were out there, I felt a strange sense of relief. Margaret's eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked genuinely shocked. Then her expression hardened into something cold and calculating. You can't throw me out, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This is David's home too, and he would never choose you over his own mother. She was right, and we both knew it. David had spent his entire life under Margaret's thumb, seeking her approval even as she criticized and controlled him. When we'd been dating, I'd thought her behavior was just overprotectiveness, a mother having trouble letting go. I'd believed it would get better once we were married, once she saw how much I loved her son. I'd been incredibly naive. We'll see about that, I said, though my heart was sinking even as the words left my mouth. Margaret smiled then, a cold, triumphant expression that made my skin crawl. Yes, we will. David, she called toward the bedroom. David, get out here. Your wife is trying to throw your mother out on the street. I heard the bed springs creak, followed by David's heavy footsteps. He appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles, wearing only boxer shorts and a confused expression. What's going on? he asked, looking between his mother and me. Your wife, Margaret spat the word like it was profanity, has decided she doesn't want me here anymore. She's trying to throw me out. David's eyes found mine, and I saw the familiar look of panic that appeared whenever he was caught between his mother and me. It was a look I'd seen far too often in our marriage. Sarah, he said, his voice careful and neutral. What happened? I wanted to explain everything. The constant demands, the insults, the way his mother treated me like a servant in my own home. I wanted to tell him how she belittled me daily, how she made me feel worthless and small, wanted him to understand that I was drowning under the weight of her expectations and abuse. Instead, I said, I told her I wouldn't make eggs Benedict because we don't have the ingredients. It sounded so petty when reduced to those simple facts. So trivial. Margaret was a master at making her victims look unreasonable while painting herself as the innocent party. Is that all? David asked, relief flooding his voice. Mom, I'm sure Sarah didn't mean? She told me to find somewhere else to stay, Margaret interrupted, her voice trembling with manufactured hurt. After everything I've done for this family, after all the help I've given you two, she wants to throw me out over breakfast. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disappointment, and finally, resignation. I knew that look. It was the same expression he wore when he was about to take the path of least resistance, which always meant giving Margaret whatever she wanted. Sarah, he said, and I could already hear the apology in his voice. She's my mother. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. She's been here for 2 weeks, David. 2 weeks of her ordering me around, insulting me, treating me like hired help. I work 40 hours a week, I pay half the bills, and I'm tired of being treated like a servant in my own home. She doesn't mean anything by it, David said, the same excuse he'd been making for years. That's just how she is. She's old-fashioned. Old-fashioned? I stared at him in disbelief. She called me a gold digger, David. She said you married beneath your station. She's been verbally abusing me for 2 weeks straight, and you think that's old-fashioned? David glanced at his mother, who had perfected an expression of wounded innocence. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd materialized from somewhere, though I noticed no actual tears. I never called her names, Margaret said, her voice quavering. I simply asked for breakfast. I didn't know that was such an unreasonable request. I felt the familiar sensation of reality shifting around me, the way it always did when Margaret was involved. Somehow, I was the villain in this story. I was the unreasonable one, the cruel daughter-in-law who wouldn't make breakfast for a sweet old lady. David, I said, one last desperate attempt to make him see. She screamed at me to get up and make her breakfast. She demanded eggs Benedict when you know we can barely afford groceries. She treats me like... Like what? Margaret interrupted, her wounded expression morphing into something sharper. Like a member of the family? Like someone who should contribute to the household instead of being weighted on hand and foot. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I could see David wavering. His mother had been rewriting reality his entire life, making him doubt his own perceptions and memories. It was a skill she'd honed to perfection. Maybe, David said slowly, we could all just try to get along. Better, Mom, maybe you could ask more nicely for things. And Sarah, maybe you could be a little more understanding. She won't be here forever. I stared at my husband, this man I'd loved enough to marry, to share my life with, and realized he was never going to choose me. Not over his mother, not when it mattered. He would always take the easy road, always find a way to make it my responsibility to keep the peace. Fine, I said quietly. I'll make the eggs. Margaret's smile was victorious, and David looked relieved that the crisis had passed. Neither of them noticed the fundamental shift that had just occurred inside me. Something had broken, not dramatically, not with fireworks and shouting, but with a quiet snap like a rubber band stretched too far. I made breakfast in silence, scrambled eggs and toast that Margaret picked at while complaining about the lack of seasoning. David ate quickly and disappeared back into the bedroom, claiming he had a headache. I cleaned up the dishes while Margaret critiqued my technique. That afternoon, while Margaret watched her soap operas and David napped off his headache, I sat at our tiny kitchen table with my laptop and began to research. I started with divorce lawyers, though I quickly realized we couldn't afford one. Then I looked into women's shelters, support groups, anything that might help me understand my options. What I found instead was information about narcissistic abuse, about emotional manipulation and gaslighting. I read article after article, each one describing my life with uncomfortable accuracy. The way Margaret isolated me from friends and family by creating drama whenever I tried to maintain relationships. The way she constantly moved the goalposts, making it impossible for me to ever be good enough. The way she triangulated between David and me, always positioning herself as the victim. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't being unreasonable or ungrateful or any of the other things Margaret had convinced me I was. I was being systematically destroyed by someone who saw me as a threat to her control over her son. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. That night, as I lay beside my sleeping husband, I made a decision. I couldn't leave, not yet. We shared a lease, shared debt, shared a life that couldn't be untangled quickly or easily. But I could change the dynamic. I could stop playing Margaret's game. The next morning, I woke up before Margaret's usual 7 a.m. screaming session. I made myself coffee and toast, got dressed, and left for work early. I left no breakfast prepared, no note explaining where I'd gone. When I returned home that evening, Margaret was waiting for me at the door. "Where were you this morning?" she demanded. "I woke up and you were gone." There was no breakfast, nothing. "I went to work," I said, hanging up my coat, "like I do every weekday." "You left without making breakfast. I had to wake David up to drive me to McDonald's." I felt a small spark of satisfaction at the thought of David being dragged out of bed to serve his mother's needs for once. "I'm sorry you had to do that," I said, though my tone suggested I was anything but sorry. "Maybe tomorrow you could set an alarm and make your own breakfast before I leave for work." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Are you being smart with me?" "I'm being practical. I work to help support this household, which means I can't always be here to wait on you." It was a small rebellion, but it felt enormous. For the first time in weeks, I'd put my own needs, my need to work, to contribute, to maintain some semblance of independence, ahead of Margaret's demands. The pattern continued over the following days. I left early for work, came home late, and spent my evenings either in the bedroom or out of the apartment entirely. I joined a book club at the library, started taking evening walks, did anything to minimize my time in Margaret's presence. Margaret's response was swift and escalating. She began leaving messes for me to clean, dishes piled high in the sink, bathroom towels on the floor, her personal belongings scattered throughout the apartment. She complained constantly to David about my attitude and disrespect. She began making increasingly outrageous demands, wanting me to drive her to appointments, to do her laundry, to cook elaborate meals. I refused them all, politely but firmly. "I'm sorry, but I have plans," became my standard response. "I'm sure you can handle it yourself." David, caught in the middle, began showing signs of strain. He snapped at me more frequently, accused me of being deliberately difficult, and spent more time out of the apartment himself. I could see him struggling with the cognitive dissonance of watching his wife refuse to cater to his mother's every whim while simultaneously being unable to acknowledge that those whims were unreasonable. The situation reached a boiling point on a Thursday evening in Margaret's third week with us. I came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing furiously. "What's that?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "A list," Margaret said without looking up, "of all the ways you've been disrespectful and negligent since I've been here. I'm documenting everything for David." I moved closer and saw pages of handwritten complaints. Refused to make breakfast on Sunday morning. Left for work without preparing food. Wouldn't drive me to the doctor. Spoke to me in a disrespectful tone. It was like reading an indictment written by someone who lived in an alternate reality, one where I was employed as Margaret's personal servant, rather than being her son's wife and an equal member of the household. "That's quite a list," I said. "Can I see it?" Margaret clutched the pad to her chest. "This is between David and me." "Actually," I said, sitting down across from her, "since it's about me, I think I have a right to see it." I held out my hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret reluctantly handed over the pad. Reading through her complaints was illuminating. Not because they were shocking, I'd lived through each incident she'd listed, but because seeing them written down revealed the pattern so clearly. Every single item on the list was about something I'd refused to do for her, some way I'd failed to anticipate her needs or prioritize her comfort over my own well-being. What struck me most was what wasn't on the list. There was no mention of the times I'd cleaned up after her, cooked meals she'd actually eaten, or listened patiently to her complaints about the neighbors, the weather, or the state of modern society. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that I worked full-time, paid half the bills, and had been providing her with free room and board for 3 weeks. In Margaret's reality, I existed solely to serve her needs. My own needs, wants, and responsibilities were irrelevant. "This is interesting," I said, handing the pad back to her. "You know what I think you should add to it?" Margaret looked suspicious but intrigued. "What?" "The part where I work 40 hours a week to help pay the rent on the apartment you're staying in for free. The part where I buy groceries with my paycheck that you eat without contributing $1. The part where you've been verbally abusing me for 3 weeks while I provide you with free food and shelter." Margaret's face flushed red. "I am not abusing anyone. I am simply trying to maintain standards in this household." "What standards?" I asked. "The standard where I'm supposed to serve you breakfast in bed? The standard where I'm not allowed to go to work without your permission? The standard where you can insult me and order me around in my own home?" "This is David's home, too." "Yes, it is. And he pays half the rent and half the utilities." "What do you pay, Margaret?" she sputtered, clearly unprepared for direct confrontation. I raised that boy. I sacrificed everything for him. I deserve—" "You deserve respect," I interrupted. "Just like everyone else. But respect goes both ways. You can't demand to be treated like a queen while treating me like a servant." Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash. "I will not be spoken to this way by some nobody who trapped my son into marriage." There it was again, the accusation that I'd trapped David. As if he'd had no agency in our relationship, no choice in proposing, no free will in saying, "I do." "How exactly did I trap him?" I asked. "I'm genuinely curious." You seduced him, filled his head with romantic nonsense. He was going places before you came along." I almost laughed. David had been working at the same auto parts store for 4 years, had dropped out of community college twice, and had been living paycheck to paycheck long before we met. But in Margaret's revisionist history, he'd been destined for greatness until I derailed his trajectory. Where was he going? I asked. Specifically. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had potential. He could have done anything. He still can. I've never stopped him from pursuing his dreams or advancing his career. In fact, I've encouraged him to go back to school multiple times. This was true, though Margaret didn't know it. I'd spent countless evenings trying to motivate David to finish his degree, to look for better jobs, to pursue the interests he claimed to have. He'd always had an excuse: too tired, too busy, too stressed. "You're holding him back," Margaret insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "By working full-time and paying half the bills? By encouraging him to better himself? By doing half the housework and asking nothing of him except basic respect and partnership?" I stood up, and Margaret took a step backward. I wasn't threatening her physically. I'm barely 5 feet 4 inches and have never intimidated anyone in my life. But there was something different in my posture, in my voice, that seemed to unnerve her. "I think," I said carefully, "that you're angry because you can't control me the way you control David. You've spent 26 years training him to prioritize your needs over his own, and you can't understand why I won't fall in line." Margaret's eyes went wide, and for a moment I saw something like fear flicker across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by cold fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed. "I love my son. Everything I do is for his own good." "I'm sure you believe that." "But love isn't about control, Margaret. Love is about wanting someone to be happy and fulfilled, even if that means they don't need you anymore." The words hit their target. Margaret's face went white, and her hands started to shake. "You're trying to turn him against me," she whispered. "I don't have to. You're doing that all by yourself." It was cruel, maybe, but it was also true. David had been pulling away from his mother gradually over the past few years, though he'd never admitted it even to himself. He'd started screening her calls, making excuses to avoid visiting, finding reasons to cut their conversations short. Margaret's extended stay had only accelerated the process, forcing him to confront behaviors he'd been excusing for decades. Margaret grabbed her legal pad and stormed toward the bedroom, calling David's name. I heard muffled voices through the thin walls, Margaret's high and agitated, David's low and weary. The conversation went on for nearly an hour. When David finally emerged, he looked exhausted. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded and followed him to the small balcony off our living room. It wasn't much, barely big enough for 2 folding chairs, but it was private. "My mother says you've been cruel to her," David said without preamble. "Is that what you think?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out, at the parking lot below. "I don't know what to think anymore. She's been different since she moved in. More demanding, and you've been different too. Colder." "I've been protecting myself," I said. "Your mother has been verbally abusing me for 3 weeks, David. She insults me daily, makes unreasonable demands, and treats me like hired help. I finally started standing up for myself, and now I'm the villain." "She's not abusing you," David said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "She's just set in her ways." "David, she screamed at me to wake up and make her breakfast on my day off. She called me a gold digger and said you married beneath your station. She demands that I wait on her hand and foot while contributing nothing to the household. If that's not abuse, what is?" David was quiet again. I could see him struggling, trying to reconcile the woman who'd raised him with the woman who'd been tormenting his wife. "She says you're trying to turn me against her," he said finally. "Are you kidding me?" The words burst out of me with more force than I'd intended. "David, I've spent 3 years trying to get along with your mother." I've bitten my tongue through countless insults and criticisms. I've made excuses for her behavior and encouraged you to maintain a relationship with her. The only thing I've ever asked for is basic respect, and she can't even give me that." David winced at my tone, but I wasn't finished. "Do you want to know what would turn you against her?" "Having kids with me. Because I guarantee you, the moment we have children, your mother will try to take over completely. She'll criticize every parenting decision I make, undermine my authority, and turn my own children against me. And you'll let her do it, just like you've let her abuse me." The words hung between us like a challenge. We'd talked about having children someday, but it had always been a vague, someday discussion. Now, faced with the reality of what life with Margaret would look like long-term, the prospect seemed terrifying. "She wouldn't do that," David said, but he sounded uncertain. "Wouldn't she? She's already convinced you that I'm the problem in this situation. She's already made you doubt your own wife's word. What do you think she'll do when there are grandchildren involved?" David's face went pale. He might have been willfully blind to his mother's behavior toward me, but he wasn't stupid. He could imagine exactly what Margaret would be like as a grandmother. Intrusive, controlling, undermining. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. It was the first time in our marriage that he'd asked that question. Usually, when conflicts arose between his mother and me, David would simply disappear or find ways to appease both sides without actually addressing the problem. Now, for the first time, he seemed to recognize that he needed to make a choice. "I want you to ask her to leave," I said. "Not because I hate her, but because she's destroying our marriage. I want you to set boundaries with her about how she treats me. And I want you to go to counseling with me so we can figure out how to handle this kind of situation in the future." David stared at me for a long moment. "And if I don't?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to be so direct. "Then you'll have made your choice," I said quietly. "And I'll have to make mine." It wasn't exactly a threat, but we both understood the implications. Our marriage couldn't survive the status quo. Something had to change, or we were headed for divorce court. David nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll talk to her." I wanted to feel relieved, but I'd been disappointed too many times before. David's conversations with his mother usually ended with him apologizing for my behavior and promising to handle me better. That night, I lay awake listening to David and Margaret's voices in the living room. Their conversation went on for hours, Margaret's voice rising and falling dramatically, David's remaining steady but firm. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone shifting from argumentative to pleading to angry and back again. Finally, around 2 a.m., the apartment fell silent. David slipped into bed beside me, and though I pretended to be asleep, I could feel the tension radiating from his body. The next morning, I woke to unusual silence. No screaming demands for breakfast, no heavy footsteps in the hallway. I found David in the kitchen, making coffee with shaking hands. "Where's your mother?" I asked. "She left," he said without looking at me. "I took her to her friend Linda's house around midnight. She's going to stay there while she looks for a new apartment." I felt a rush of emotions, relief, gratitude, and surprisingly, guilt. Margaret might have been awful to me, but she was still David's mother, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry," I said. "I know that was hard for you." David turned to face me, and I was shocked by how exhausted he looked. "No, I'm sorry. I should have done it weeks ago. I should have done it years ago." We stood there in our small kitchen, the morning light streaming through the window, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe freely. "What changed your mind?" I asked. David was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "She made me choose," he said finally. She said if I didn't control my wife and put you in your place, she would never speak to me again. She said I had to decide whether I was a husband or a son. I felt my heart clench at the cruelty of it. Even in defeat, Margaret had tried to manipulate her son, forcing him to choose between his wife and his mother, instead of simply accepting that she needed to treat me with basic respect. "And you chose to be a husband," I said. "I chose to be a man," David corrected. For the first time in my life, I think I actually stood up to her. And you know what? The world didn't end. She didn't have a heart, or attack or disown me forever. She just left. Over the following weeks, our marriage began to heal. Without Margaret's constant presence and interference, David and I were able to reconnect. We started talking again, really talking, not just managing logistics and avoiding conflict. We went to couples counseling, where David began to understand the extent of his mother's emotional manipulation and its impact on our relationship. Margaret did call, of course. At first, it was daily, long, guilt-laden conversations where she alternated between playing the victim and trying to convince David that I was controlling him. But David had learned to set boundaries. He kept the conversations short, refused to discuss our marriage with her, and didn't allow her to badmouth me. Gradually, the calls became less frequent. Margaret found a new apartment and, eventually, a new target for her controlling behavior. A lonely widower from her church who seemed flattered by her attention. David and I never did have children, not because of Margaret, but because we both realized that we were happier as a couple than we would have been as parents. We traveled instead, pursuing hobbies and careers that fulfilled us individually and as a team. Margaret never apologized for her behavior during those 3 weeks, and I never expected her to. Narcissists rarely acknowledge their mistakes, and I'd learned that my happiness didn't depend on her approval or recognition of wrongdoing. What mattered was that I'd found my voice. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, and to refuse to accept abuse disguised as family dynamics. I'd discovered that respect isn't something you earn through endless service and accommodation. It's something you demand and maintain. And David learned that being a good son doesn't mean sacrificing your wife's well-being on the altar of your mother's ego. He learned that love isn't about control, and that healthy relationships require boundaries, even with family members. Sometimes I still think about that morning when Margaret screamed at me to wake up and make her breakfast. It seems like such a small thing now, such a trivial demand that sparked such a massive change in our lives. But revolutions often start with simple acts of refusal. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply say no and mean it. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.